Hello and welcome back to the Underscored podcast brought to you by Young Voices. I'm your host, Stephen Kent. We're getting back into the swing of things after a little holiday. July 4th was excellent. I hope yours was wonderful and patriotic as well. We're going to be talking about a couple of things today related to what happened over the holiday. Independence Day. What does it mean to be independent, politically and otherwise? We're going to be talking to Jordan Lancaster and Alex Muresianu, both of Young Voices, who have sort of opposing viewpoints on this issue, and myself as well. It's going to be a good conversation.
Relationships with political parties are transactional to some degree, and you sort of have a negotiation to say not everybody can get everything that they want.
Then, in the middle of that, we're going to also talk to Nolan Gray, an expert at city planning and market urbanism, on Stranger Things and the return of the show on Netflix for its third season, focused largely in the great American mall boom of the 1980s. Malls are dying now. I'm going to talk to Nolan about how that happened, what is changing in retail, and what needs to happen for these great spaces to be used appropriately in the future.
So this is part of the problem with malls, is that they're what we would call fragile. So when those big anchor stores like JCPenney or Sears or Macy's start to go out of business, it's much harder to keep the foot traffic needed to support smaller businesses.
All right, well, let's get started here on independence. I'm very happy to have with me now Alex Muresianu and Jordan Lancaster, both of Young Voices. Welcome to you both. It's nice to have you on the Underscored podcast. We're here today to talk about Justin Amash and his Declaration of Independence from the Republican Party. This came out on July 4th, Independence Day, an op-ed in the Washington Post. Justin Amash declared that he was no longer going to be part of the GOP. He said, "I'm declaring my independence and leaving the Republican Party. No matter your circumstance, I'm asking you to join me in rejecting the partisan loyalties and rhetoric that divide and dehumanize us. The two-party system has evolved into an existential threat to American principles and institutions." I've got you, Jordan and Alex, on because I really want some opposing kind of viewpoints on this. There's a lot of debate going on in right of center circles about Justin Amash's motivations, what's really leading him to this point, whether or not he is actually, carrying, I guess, the mantle of good politics. Alex, I want to start with you because you work at Reason. Reason is very much aligned with the Justin Amash worldview and sort of his brand of politics. Nick Gillespie and Matt Welch and Catherine Manga Ward all over there are very excited about whatever Justin Amash tends to do and this move. They view it pretty favorably. Why do you think that this is a good move for Justin Amash and says something positive about his politics and where we're sort of at with the rift between the Democrats and the Republicans?
Well, I would say that as far as Amash goes, relationships with political parties are transactional to some degree, and you sort of have a negotiation to say not everybody can get everything that they want. But the idea is that, you're part of a coalition and you get part of what you want out of the coalition as policy or as part of the platform. Yeah. And I think Amash's calculation is pretty reasonable that, if you come to the negotiating table with someone, you've got to be willing to walk away. And I think Amash's sort of view that, look, there's nothing for me here in the GOP if this is what the GOP is going to be, so I'm going to leave. I think that's reasonable. I think that there are values to having political parties, and I think you can never get 100% of what you want, but I think Amash walking away is a pretty reasonable response to the state of the Republican Party right now.
Jordan, you're here because I caught wind of a pretty robust critique by you on the Twitter about this move by Justin Amash. You're not so starry-eyed about this development with him. Can you tell me, I don't know, just to get us started, what is your critique? What are you sort of feeling about the framing of this exit from the Republican Party and Justin Amash's principles here?
Right. So my critique was mostly centered on, I didn't really see him as a Republican. Clearly he ran as a GOPer, but ever since Trump, he's kind of been a thorn in the side of the GOP. I didn't really see him negotiating with them in so much as fighting with them. So I was a little bit surprised by his op-ed because it seems very late. I think he parted with the GOP a long time ago. And so the way I saw it was he put out this op-ed on Independence Day, kind of looking for that media attention, because I think it was a smart move because he was down in the polls. And a lot of people were framing it as kind of this big sacrifice. You know, he's not going to be able to run with the Republican besides his name. But that wasn't really helping him, obviously. He was 16 points down, getting beaten by a Republican in the primary. So I see it a little differently. I think it was a strategic move, and I think he saw it to kind of get the press attention.
There's a lot there that Jordan kind of laid out. I want to focus on the first part of it, which was the assertion that Justin Amash was never really Republican, that he ran as a GOPer, but because of sort of the rise of Trumpism in 2015, and Justin Amash had been there since 2011 was when he was entered into the House, that he was never really part of this group. Do you buy that? Because I find that to be quite a twist of the way that things have broken down in Republican politics and how quickly they have changed.
Yeah, well, I think when it comes, again, as I said in my sort of first answer, as far as political parties go, political parties have a lot of different factions within them. And I'm not really sure what makes a real Republican now or maybe 5 years ago. I mean, there are moderates, there's, the establishment, there's hardline social conservatives, libertarians like Amash.
Yeah, it's a coalition.
And so I think that he was a founding member, as I recall, of the Freedom Caucus, which is, the conservative wing of the Republican Party. I would say that, I mean, if he's not a Republican or wasn't really a Republican, then I guess Jim Jordan and Mark Meadows weren't really Republicans, and they seem pretty Republican to me. But I do think that I'm also skeptical of I think the decision to release the op-ed on July 4th is like a media attention getting move. But as a general rule, Amash is very press shy. That is the reputation that he has among Capitol Hill reporters, as far as I understand, that he's not a media hound. So I think a lot of the criticism, I'm not saying that this is what Jordan is saying, but I'm saying that this is what some critics of him are saying, that it was, this is a publicity stunt or whatever. But Amash's general attitude towards the press indicates to me otherwise.
All right, and this is where we're going to take a quick break on the question of Justin Amash and his independence and go over to Stranger Things. Because, y'all, I've been watching this throughout the holiday that we've just been on. It was a great season of this great show on Netflix, and it had a lot to do with politics and public policy just right underneath the surface. And I wanted to talk to someone in Young Voices who knows just about everything there is to know about malls and city planning and the way that retail in America has changed. So like I mentioned earlier on in the show, we're going to have on Nolan Gray right now. So Nolan, having just finished Stranger Things season 3, my mind is sort of in the mall. It was really a time warp experience with this show focusing around malls in the 1980s and all the life that was in these complexes. You're an urbanist and city planner. Can you lay out how the shopping mall of that variety came to be and what the thinking was behind it? How did we get there?
Yeah, so it's kind of a long story. So essentially what was happening in the 70s and 80s, as early as the post-war period, where millions of Americans are moving out to the suburbs. They have cars now, and they're nowhere near traditional downtown main streets of the kind that you saw in the first 2 seasons of Stranger Things. And so what's happening is that shopping is following them out there. And in many cases, it's getting a little bit of help from local government. So they're giving these mall facilities free land, or they're giving them free infrastructure. So they're building huge road upgrades so that it's easy to get in and out of malls. And so all that's happening in the 70s and 80s. And at the same time, the economy is healthy, the disposable income is going up. And so this consumer culture is really forming after the post-war period. And that's when you really see the rise of malls.
That's interesting. So, in the show, the older characters really kind of take issue with how the mall hollowed out the historic downtown. You mentioned you're at the beginning of season 3 of Stranger Things, and you'll see this probably in the next 1 or 2 episodes. And you just mentioned it was kind of like the suburbs and sort of the decentralization of life near a downtown of a city, or particularly a small town in the Midwest. So the mall kind of killed local businesses, so they say, and made this Midwestern town into what we now know them as, in most cases, as a ghost town. But one thing I noticed in the show was that despite the groaning about the mall is a very happy place. It's very diverse. There's tons of mingling and cross sections of communities that you didn't see in the show previously when you were centered in the downtown areas. The environment was electric. Did malls foster a sort of diversity that main streets could not?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the whole idea of mall, the original idea behind them, from the architects who were designing them, was to create a kind of public space in a part of cities that didn't have any public space, right? So many suburbs, which is where many of the young characters in Stranger Things are growing up, they're not necessarily near downtown. It's not necessarily very accessible. So to have a public space where they can go and kind of hang out and mingle without parent supervision in a kind of public space is a positive thing. And malls are still very diverse. I mean, I work in Queens, and you go to a mall, and it's an incredibly diverse place for a lot of young people. And so many malls are still thriving. The trouble is that there's questions about whether or not it's a zero-sum game. So traditional main streets were really vital and active places. And unlike malls that weren't necessarily controlled by one company or weren't necessarily dependent on 1 or 2 anchor stores. So this is part of the problem with malls, is that they're what we would call fragile. So when those big anchor stores like JCPenney or Sears or Macy's start to go out of business, it's much harder to keep the foot traffic needed to support smaller businesses like Claire's or Bath and Body Works or Radio Shack. And so those businesses start to struggle. And so, we're kind of coming around the end of the first life cycle for malls, right? So most real estate's built with a 30 to 50 year life cycle. And we're starting to hit that with the first front of malls. And that's why we're seeing this huge closure, because in many cases they weren't sustainable in the long term. Whether or not main streets are going to come back and fill that void, it's happening in some parts of the country, but it's yet to be seen.
Yeah, market trends are so interesting because there is in some way a return to the old, where malls have sort of gone out of style. I think people have gotten pretty disenchanted with that sort of big box approach to shopping. And there's sort of a cultural move back towards those old things. But then, of course, you have e-commerce and digital retail, which is still just, dominating the landscape. You mentioned that malls are dying. They're pretty much sleepy in most parts of the country. I was at one yesterday, and it was slightly depressing just being inside for 20 minutes. What in your view is killing malls that maybe goes beyond e-commerce? And does it really matter? Like, hardly anyone is talking about this in the public policy space.
Yeah, well, I mean, just e-commerce is an important element of it, because what e-commerce is killing is it's killing what we call dry goods retail, which basically means things like clothes, shoes, and jewelry. And those are the cash cows for the anchor stores like Sears, Macy's, JCPenney. If people are buying those online, they're not having to go to malls, and they're not stepping outside the JCPenney to go to Auntie Anne's and get a pretzel, or to, meander around and maybe go into a GameStop, right? So when those big anchors fail and they're dependent on dry goods, the whole mall kind of goes bust. And this is a big thing that malls are scrambling to find right now, is what's the new anchor. So more and more malls are putting in things like gyms. They're putting in things like movie theaters. They're trying to add more sit-down restaurants. They're trying to find new things that are going to draw people in, be that primary anchor use. And that's one of the main things that's killing malls. I think another thing, too, is that there's more interest in cities now. So cities kind of hollowed out right around the time, of Stranger Things Season 3. More and more people were moving out to the suburbs to buy single-family homes. But now what you're seeing is a shift where younger people, young professionals, college graduates, and also retirees who need to downsize, they're moving back in the cities, and they're bringing the money with them. and they're looking for a different kind of lifestyle. They're not looking for a kind of drive-to lifestyle that malls provided. At the same time, too, a lot of traditional main streets learned lessons from malls. Many main streets formed business improvement districts, which really prioritized keeping main streets clean, safe, having businesses coordinate to host events, things of that nature, basically to make it the kind of place that you want to go and spend time. There are a number of factors here for why malls are struggling and why some main streets are coming back. But there's an unknown part of it of, well, what kind of place do people want to spend time in?
Yeah. Nolan, to kind of round us out here, what needs to happen in the public policy space so that we can transition from one era to the next? There is no doubt that the transition away from Main Street to mall culture was painful for a lot of people. And Andrew Yang, the Democratic presidential candidate, is now talking about how painful the transition away from malls is going to be, because you have so many jobs tied up in these buildings. You also have home values tied up in these buildings, where just 2 decades ago, having a mall in the area, increased the prospects of your home value. And if these are going to turn into ghost towns and just like giant empty lots, that's going to be quite a drag on that part of the market. So I hate to say, what does the government need to do here? But what can the government and elected officials, policymakers do to get us to the next phase of this story?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a question that a lot of local policymakers are grappling with right as we speak. I mean, malls, as you mentioned, are a huge source of jobs and a huge source of what are called rateables, or property that can be taxed and raise money for things like schools and parks. Yeah, it's good that Andrew Yang is thinking about this issue. I mean, his proposal is more of kind of a bailout for mall owners. I think a more straightforward solution here is to change the underlying land use regulations that affect malls. So most malls are subject to zoning rules, which basically only allow a mall to be built on those sites. And this really hurts those spaces because it's very, very hard to reuse them for more modern mixed-use spaces. So one of the things that you're seeing, especially in places like California or the Sun Belt, is what are called lifestyle centers. And so this combines traditional, mall-style retail with apartments and also with office space. The idea being that if you get a lot of different uses mixed together, there's always going to be some foot traffic. There's always going to be a source of demand for the retail. There'll be a lot of people coming in and out of apartments and office space, and that'll make malls more sustainable. And so they're being rebranded as lifestyle centers. So clearing up the zoning rules that prevent things like adding multifamily or apartments onto these sites would be really helpful. And this is where we've seen, if you look in places where malls are still quite successful, for example, in Latin America, part of what's going on in Latin America is you have this new rising middle class that has a lot of disposable income. But part of it too is that, malls in Latin America will have things like supermarkets, or they'll have things like call centers, or they'll have things like hospitals attached to them. And so that sort of mixture of uses makes them much more sustainable. They're not dependent on people coming out just for one store, or they're not dependent on teenagers thinking it's cool to hang around in the mall all day.
Yeah, imagine that. Embracing a little spontaneity can actually make it a pretty vital business model. Nolan, to finish up, what do you enjoy, or what have you enjoyed in your life about going to malls? I'm sure you have some positive and negative opinions about malls, but what did you always enjoy? Because for me, it was obviously Hot Topic and Spencer's, and I used to go and just mostly frequent those stores. What do you look for when you go to a mall, and in younger years as well?
Oh, that's a great question. I don't tell the urbanist this, but I can remember as a kid, one of the first sort of feelings of awe I can remember having was going to the mall over Christmas, over the Christmas shopping season, and just being blown away by just the amount of stuff. And the way it all gets there. I mean, I can remember specifically being in a Sears and just thinking about like how many hundreds, thousands of articles of clothes were like combined into this one space. And I don't think I felt the awe out of like a consumer perspective, but just a perspective of, wow, here's this huge thing that's been organized. As a teenager, I spent a lot of time in malls. I grew up in the suburbs. There weren't a lot of urban spaces. If they were at the time, most of the people had left them. They weren't particularly safe. They weren't particularly dynamic or interesting. I really appreciate that about malls. I mean, what malls tap into is this traditional sort of feeling of walking down a dynamic and interesting street. I think the big question is, how do we bring back that feeling? And part of that's going to go to reviving main streets and creating these new sort of downtowns that people like to visit. More and more downtowns are coming back. And part of it's going to be building new kinds of malls that have mixtures of uses that are more sustainable, that are less dependent on one or two shops. And I think that's positive. I think that there is something, Stranger Things taps into this, right? That there are serious problems with malls. They were poaching potentially business from older retailers. They were dependent on subsidies. A theme in season 3, which I'm still early in it and I don't want to have any spoilers, but they hint at the mall getting a ton of subsidies. And that's very realistic, right? Many of these malls were heavily subsidized by local and state governments. So if we can find a way to tap into what people love and what people really enjoy about malls, but in a way that's more sustainable and involves less sort of crony politics, I think that would be a really fantastic thing. And that's the challenge for local and state policymakers right now.
Well, I trust you working on this issue, Nolan Gray. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about it.
Thanks for having me.
And with that, let's return to our panel, Jordan Lancaster and Alex Muresianu. Jordan, you kind of take issue with some of the posturing that has kind of been going on here. We talked one-on-one a little bit about, again, this sort of July 4th Independence Day framing that it's very sort of high and mighty and lofty. I don't really look at it that way. I sort of just look at it as a good news hook, and with, very simply, kind of going back to the anecdotes about George Washington and his criticism of political parties. July 4th is just sort of as good a reason as any to make that stand. And also it's a little punny, like it literally is kind of a pun. So is it really that big of a deal that he makes news out of it? Because again, this is a pretty media shy individual. He's not been around on TV in the 5 years that he's been in DC.
I think that sort of speaks to his motivations, kind of what I got at before, that he's looking to brand himself as this libertarian independent, whereas he didn't really seek to do that in the press as much before. I think he's looking to capitalize on this independent status that he established even before the op-ed came out. Like I said, he saw that he wasn't doing well in the polls. I even see the past few days he's positioned himself for a potential 2020 run, which I think would be interesting. But, I don't know what his motivations were, but I think using that good of a news hook on July 4th kind of speaks to that.
He's angling for the CNN contributorship, maybe. Well, part of Justin Amash's main complaint has been that the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, but particularly the Republican Party where he's been living, has just sort of become a means to an end and not actually any sort of exercise in preserving congressional power and coveting power from the executive. That the Congress in general is not fulfilling its role in the design of our democratic system. I think it's pretty hard to argue with that. I think, of course, that is true. But, Jordan, why is it so bad that he makes that point about the Republican Party and sort of make that break? I think that would be good for our politics, and most people would view that and sort of view that admirably.
Right. I don't necessarily disagree with the principle on which he made his argument, but there's the point that making change comes from within. You can be a third party or even break from the party you're in and still make a change working with that party. I think even as the GOP's changed obviously since Trump. I don't think anyone would disagree with that. But he's also kind of the person that will die on every hill. Calling for impeachment of the Republican sitting president in his third term.
All he did was call for consideration of impeachment, that there was meaningful evidence there to actually move forward on it, and that Nancy Pelosi was actually committing a highly political and antithetical act to the formation of the Constitution and the rules on impeachment because she thinks it would threaten Democratic power in the House to actually fulfill the role of the House in this process. I mean, that's a pretty meaningful critique.
Right. But at what point is that not helpful? I mean, he's in his third term. Personally, I don't really see impeachment as probable, debatably even possible. So at what point is he so far from the Republicans that he's just being a contrarian? He's not willing to work with them.
I guess that there is some degree of, I don't know if you guys have seen the movie Jerry Maguire, but it does kind of remind me of the scene in Jerry Maguire when Tom Cruise is giving this sort of very impassioned speech to the company that he's working at. He's a sports agent, and sort of towards the end he goes, "And who's with me?" And like everybody sort of stares at him blankly. It seems like kind of how Justin Amash was doing within the GOP, and I don't. I think the impeachment move. There came a point during the Nixon impeachment where Republicans decided to turn their back, and I don't think that. It had to start somewhere, I suppose. There, I can't remember the specifics. And as far as sort of working within the party, I think that I do believe, sort of with what am I saying? As Jonah Goldberg sort of has talked about before, the sort of need that the problem isn't that the parties are too strong, it's that the parties are too weak and they can't control the base, basically. And so as long as the base is in control and the party establishment can't, try to rein them in, then you're going to get these sort of very strong polarization.
Yeah, that strikes me as absolutely true when it comes to elections, and not so much when it comes to the actual matter of governance and sort of control of the floor. And you've seen this breakout as well on the Democratic side between Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and sort of their cabal, and then Nancy Pelosi. And they've had some sort of renewed sniping in the press over the past 2 days, where Nancy Pelosi has once again flippantly sort of dismissed their group of four as being sort of unmeaningful in the larger process. And AOC had even sort of tipped her hat to Amash in what he did here. It really seems to me we sort of have a younger generation rebelling against business as usual, like putting aside where these sort of democratic socialists on the Democratic side fall politically. They really seem to have the same approach and hangups about the way that DC works right now. I think that's interesting to look at.
Yeah, I do think that there's some issue here where, again, they might agree about the problem of a partisan sort of death spiral, as Amash calls it, and I think they might, both have equivalent problems with their own party's leadership. But I also think that might be true, but how you actually move forward from there is kind of a different question. People like to talk about sometimes, I believe Matt Iglesias coined this term a while ago, called the pundit fallacy, which is that, every pundit's take is that, what X person really needs to do to win the nomination or win in the general election is like adopt everything that I want to see happen. And I think there's sort of a version of that in like that politicians do, which is when they talk about like setting aside partisanship. It's like, I want to let's all set aside partisanship and pettiness and come together over these things that I want to do. And see, that's sort of my thing when I see like AOC agreeing with Amash, is that like I don't think that actually means anything tangible. I think that usually when we've seen cross-partisan like agreement, and maybe sometimes that's over bad things, it's been like, Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich eventually coming to agreements about like budget deals, or Tip O'Neill and Reagan coming to agreements about how to fund Social Security for the next 20 years. And I think those have a sort of decidedly different, it's sort of a very different group of people and tone, I guess, than these sort of rebellions within the parties right now.
Jordan, what do you think about that? Do you think there's any sort of alignment generationally in sort of how this new partisan bickering is playing out?
I see a lot more support for that kind of group of four that Pelosi dismisses within the base. I think that's kind of relevant because the Democratic candidates right now have adopted a lot of the same language that that group has been advocating for, like some of the same policies. I don't think I really see that as much in the GOP. I wouldn't mind it if it were to arise from the GOP, but I think there's still a very strong group of people who are just like Trump GOPers right now. So that's kind of limiting where the third party can go.
Absolutely. Well, I think that kind of brings us to the end of this discussion of Justin Amash and the rise of independence or independence rising in the Republican Party, or not rising, probably is going nowhere. I think to round us out, the question of libertarian voters versus independent voters. Alex, you're working at Reason, but I've always kind of considered you to be sort of a reform conservative. Maybe I am wrong on that, and please feel free to correct me. But do you think that libertarians overcount themselves and view their policy positions and their stances as more popular than they actually are?
I would say, as far as I don't think your characterization. I would say I'm somewhere at the intersection of libertarian and reform econ of some kind. But I would say, as far as like I think that libertarians are less. I think they're more. I think there's been sort of a change in the conventional wisdom that, like, all of a sudden there's this sort of common trope that I think that there was some study, I think it was Lee Drutman, that basically said, like, oh, look, libertarians don't actually exist. And I think that's kind of silly. I think that there are a lot of that libertarians are a consequential group. And one of the reasons that I like to point to, that I can't remember who pointed out originally, was New Hampshire. New Hampshire is a swing state. It doesn't have, it has a handful of electoral votes, and last election, I think it was decided by a couple hundred votes. And if libertarians are like 5%, let's say like a libertarian or libertarian Republicans are 5 to 10% of the Republican Party, like a 5 to 10% swing in Republican turnout one way or the other is like a huge friggin' deal in like a swing state. Yeah. That's the whole election. And so if, you can't, just because, libertarians might not be the dominant faction in the GOP or haven't historically, I think that there's still a group that if you alienated them, if you alienated libertarians, you might be really screwed.
Jordan, you're an independent. Do you view independent voters as sort of a still rising phenomenon, or do you think that we're getting more red and blue?
I think we're probably getting pulled more to the sides when people do vote red and blue, more polarized. But I think with that does come the rise of independence, if that makes sense. So as the parties move more left and more right, the people that do vote independent gets higher. Yeah. I think we have to look no further than the amount of people who quickly jump to third-party voters to blame them for upset elections. To kind of prove that point.
That's a good point. Well, Alex Muresianu, Jordan Lancaster, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this today. Really appreciate your insights. You can find them on Twitter. I will put their handles in the show notes so you can get connected with them and follow them and all of their work. This has been another episode of Underscored. I'm your host, Stephen Kent, and we'll be back next week with more. Until then, stay free.